So here's our code as we left it in the other program. We have the anonymous function, self-executing anonymous function. Okay, so that we can encapsulate our code so this is no longer in global space, which is good. However, we need to be able to access this calculate page function, and we can't. It's inside of an anonymous function. So we can do this by passing in parameters. So inside of here we'll say, we'll call it vendor ABC and then undefined. And so what we're doing here is we're saying this anonymous function expects the parameter vendor ABC and then expects a parameter undefined. Okay. Now, at the end of this function, since we're executing it, we're going to actually pass values into those parameters, or at least into the first one. Window is a special object in JavaScript. It is basically the global namespace. Okay, so by calling window, we're basically calling the global namespace, and we're going to say window dot vendor ABC equals window dot vendor ABC or an empty object. In JavaScript, you can define an object by saying var my object equals that. When we say my object equals open curly brace, close curly brace, we are defining a variable name but not really assigning it anything other than saying that this is an object. And on an object, we could then add in properties, some property. We could even add in new functions. My object dot some function equal function. And then if you needed to access that object and that property, that's what you would do, is you can call my object dot some property and get the value that was assigned in there. Okay. So this my object up here, I'm outside the function, so this would be a global variable. Okay. And that's really the same thing as saying window dot my object. Although I wouldn't do var at that point. I'm just saying window dot my object. That's really the same thing as saying var my object. Because when we put something in global space, it shoves it on this special window object that JavaScript has in all the browsers or any kind of place that's running. It has an object called window. Okay. So what are we doing here with our anonymous function having a parameter of vendor ABC and another parameter of undefined? And then when we call this function, we're passing in window.vendorABC equal vendor or window.vendorABC or an empty object. What is this doing? So let's talk about this piece right here first. Just like we're initializing this my object to this, we could do something to the effect of vendor ABC equals an object, right? And that's really what we're doing. This OR is special in JavaScript. What this allows it to do is say, hey, set this equal to this value, or if that value doesn't have anything in it, if that's undefined, then set it to this value. Okay? So what we're doing here is this is its own statement, right? So this is its own statement right there. It says, hey, I want to set window.vendorabc equal to either what it already is, so I want to leave it alone, or if it's undefined, then I wanted to initialize it as a new object, as a new piece of memory. And that's really all it's doing, is either assigning this to what's already been assigned because this is thing's been called before, or it's setting it to a new object. So the first time it comes in, window.vendorabc will be a new object. Anytime after that, it will be whatever this currently was. So any other properties or functions that may have been assigned to this guy will stay intact. Okay, so I'm going to delete all this down here and explain one more time what the first parameter is doing here. Okay, so the first parameter, we called it vendor ABC, and then inside of our value that we're passing to that parameter, we're setting it either to itself, or if it's undefined, we're going to set it to a new object. Okay, and that's the first value. Now, the second value, what is that? Well, the second value that's coming in should be going to this parameter called undefined. And the whole reason why we have that is in case some other JavaScript library, or maybe even the app that we're running in themselves, maybe we're the vendor that's making this elegant library, and we're running in an app where they decided to say var undefined equals hello. Okay, if they did this, well, actually put that in global space. If they did this, they made a variable and they called the variable undefined. Then if we had logic to test against undefined, right? So if we said something like, if page is equal to undefined, do this logic. And we'll talk about the if statements and conditions in a later lesson. We talked about booleans in a previous lesson and how we can compare values. So that's what we're trying to do here, simulate here, is we're comparing, hey, this is undefined, then do some logic. Well, if undefined is supposed to be never been defined, but somebody in the app or some other library that's loaded up in the same, in the same application we're running in, has set undefined, this special JavaScript keyword, to something else, then this will not function as we expect, because undefined is not never been defined, it's now hello, or whatever they set it up to. And so I was talking about undefined is kind of quirky, it's kind of special. And this is one of the things. In JavaScript, there's no special, no special values that can't be overwritten. If something's in JavaScript, you can set it to something else. Even if the system defaults it to some value like undefined here, you can set it to something else. Okay? So, remember in the other program, I'm going to bring up the other program real quick. Remember in this other program when we had say hello, name, and age. And when I first passed it in, I passed in my name, but I didn't pass in the age, right? When we run this, we get, hello there, Chad. I heard you were undefined years old. Because age was never given a value, so it has the default value of undefined. That same principle, I'm going to undo our change so we can put it back to 5. But this same principle of not passing a value into a parameter is what we're doing here. We're having a parameter and we called it undefined. That way, if we ever use undefined in here, since we're not actually passing in, we're not actually passing in some value here. If we passed in that value, then this parameter, undefined, would be all these A's. Of course, that's not what we want. Instead, we don't want to pass anything to that parameter, which means that undefined will truly be the real JavaScript's version of undefined. That way, if we have any kind of code in here that relies on undefined, it's going to work the way we expect, and nobody else's JavaScript, even the app's JavaScript, if we're a vendor, is going to get messed up. So it looks weird. It's kind of a funky syntax, but this is the pattern, and it's one of those things you can just kind of copy and paste once you determine what your namespace should be here. And to follow this in our app, we'll do the exact same thing. We'll get rid of this undefined equals hello. We don't want that. We should never redefine undefined. But what we're going to do here is we'll just call this, why not just call it app? So we'll call it app undefined. So those are our two parameters for this function. And then down here, we're going to say app. We're going to actually say window.app equals window.app if it's there. If that's undefined, though, we want to be an empty object or a new object. By doing that, we're part of the way there. We at least have it set up so that now we should be able to talk to this, because we have basically made a global variable. So at this point, our app has a global variable. It's called app. But this is so we could actually access this stuff inside of our JavaScript if need be. So again, we try to avoid global namespace. And app, if there's some vendor out there and they called theirs app, then we would have a problem here. So again, you might actually want to call this maybe your company name or something very specific, or at least know what third-party vendor libraries that you're bringing in, third-party libraries, to make sure that your special name, your one item that's in global namespace does not conflict with somebody else's. Okay. So in this case here, I'm setting the app namespace, if you will, to app, while I'm setting the vendors to, in theory, their company name, vendor ABC. We're still not done yet. Even though we are passing in these values to these parameters, index.html, who's trying to call this calculate page, still can't get to this calculate page, because over here our calculate page needs to be assigned to our namespace, to our object, to our global variable. So we'll do this by saying vendor abc.calculatePage equals this function. Okay. So now we have this anonymous function that we're assigning to this variable. And this is why assigning functions to variables are so important, because now this means that I have exposed this function to our vendor ABC object, to this namespace. So what this buys me now, the whole reason for this, I'm going to save this, is I can go back to my index, and now instead of calculate page, I'm going to call vendor abc.calculate page, because now I have access to that through this one global variable, which is an object that might have a bunch of functions or a bunch of properties or a bunch of variables. I can call calculate page. So let's run that. So we know that my page is working correctly, right? Because I have a variable called page, and it's inside of my scope, and so that's all working fine. And now this should give me the number, and it does, 9525 9525, and I was actually able to call it. Because beforehand, if I simply had calculate page here, and try to call it, I'm going to get it undefined, because it doesn't know what that is. So we need to call it on the global object, and then actually expose it on the global object. So this is just one of the two patterns that we'll be discussing. This pattern is the self-executing anonymous function, where we are using parameters, and in particular the first parameter, as our global object or you could think of as a namespace, which is just a way to keep our code separated from others' code. And we expose certain functions and certain properties by assigning them to this global object. In the next lesson, we'll be discussing object literal notation. And the object literal notations will provide a basis to discuss the second pattern.